Sunday morning. So, yeah, I hope, I think today I'll be meeting you twice, now and then the afternoon 1:30 to 3:30 class. So I think with this, I'll be completing the topics that have been allotted to me. So what we have now is the last unit, okay, of what I was supposed to do is the short fiction prose. So where you all know we have one story, The Accompanist by Anita Desai, and then we have Interpreter of Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri. So these are two short stories. So this is short fiction. And then we have the classic text by Ambedkar, The Annihilation of Caste. So I thought what I would do is maybe I'll just do the two stories now in the morning session. So we will discuss both Anita Desai as well as Jhumpa Lahiri. And then I'll go on to the afternoon. We will take up Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste. Okay, so that's the plan in general. Now, if you remember in Unit 3, we did fiction, that is novel, where we looked at writers, basically the trio, as I have been telling you, three major novelists of the 1930s. I mean, I have also told you that, they are significant writers and they paved the way for the Indian novel in English. And if you remember, when I had talked to you about the rise of the Indian novel in English, I had told you about how the novel continued its journey after the big three. So after the 1930s, we had talked about the 1960s, if you remember. So 1930s, you have the pre-independence era. And so 1960s, another significant phase. It's not as if others did not write in between. Novels were being written, but just for some kind of convenience, I'm giving you this kind of phase. So 1960s phase is we are in independent India, and there are many writers, but of them, Anita Desai is also one of the very important writers of this period who starts writing at this time. Then another writer I had mentioned, though even I have not really read his books, is Arun Joshi. So Anita Desai and Arun Joshi are considered to be writers who explore the inner, the inner mind. I mean, the inner psyche, the inner side of the human personality. Because if you remember Untouchable, Man-Eater of Malgudi and Kantapura, all these novels, they also focus on the external action. For example, Kantapura is set during the Satyagraha period. Untouchable, of course, is in the life of one individual, Baka, and it is also external. Of course, Baka does, Anand does talk about Baka's state of mind and his thoughts, and Rajarao also. It's many places it's quite philosophical, and Narayan, we saw how he uses the Bhasmasura myth. Of course, it was written later, not in the 30s, but still, all these three writers we saw were focusing on the external action, right? The external happenings, the external reality. Whereas when we talk about particularly Anita Desai and then Arun Joshi, these novelists were writing in a post-independence period where there had been a lot of expectations, among all the people, because we had struggled so hard to gain the independence, and there were high expectations that there would be a lot of progress, and every section of society would progress. And definitely, it was one of hope during the freedom struggle. But now freedom has come and gone, and of course, you have the there is a sense of despair among some of the writers, a little bit of hopeless. Lack of hope, because what was expected did not happen. So there were several problems in the country. With relation to Anita Desai, of course, deals with the gender also. But basically, it was, where these writers started exploring the inner aspects of the human life as such. So these two writers, that's why Anita Desai's novels, are seen as psychological novels also. There is a lot of exploration of the human psyche also. So Anita Desai belongs to this period. Though in your unit, first Jhumpa Lahiri is mentioned, I'm going to do Anita Desai because Jhumpa Lahiri is a contemporary writer. I'll come to her after I discuss Anita Desai. So when we are talking about Anita Desai, I'll just give you a first short kind of an introduction to the writer and what her objectives are, okay, and what are her concerns, and then we can go on to discuss the short story. Again, Accompanist is a short story. I'm sure, if you don't have the time to read longer novels, both the stories I think you can read, whether it is the Accompanist or later Jhumpa Lahiri's interpreter of maladies. Okay. So coming to Anita Desai, I'll just kind of give you an introduction to the writer to talk about her concerns and her achievements also. Now, Anita Desai, many of you may have heard of Kiran Desai, right? Who again got the Booker Prize, the Pulitzer Prize. So, Kiran Desai is the daughter of Anita Desai. So, some of you, the younger generation, may have heard of Kiran Desai. Some of you, of course, who are into literature would be already familiar with Anita Desai. Now, coming to Anita Desai, we are told that she started writing in when she was 9 years old. Okay, and so very early start in the writing for her, and we now know that she is one of India's most respected novelists, and she has achieved a lot in her life. So she has written several novels, and her novels have been shortlisted for the Booker Prize 3 times, and she has received the Sahitya Academy Award, okay, for her book Fire on the Mountain, and so there's a lot for her. Coming to a few details about Anita Desai, she was born in 1937 in Mussoorie in India, and actually Anita Desai's mother was a German, and her father is an Indian, okay, so Bengali, and so she kind of grew up, speaking German at home, and she studied in Delhi, and then so she grew up speaking German. She grew up speaking Hindi. Of course, English was there, and then she did her BA in University of Delhi, and somehow she has said in her interviews that as a child, she always used to notice how there was something different about her families in terms of culture, in terms of the community culture, because as I told you, her mother was German, but her mother, who came here to live, she had adapted and she had practiced several Indian cultures and tradition, but somehow her mother never could fit, because as I think we can understand today much better, because European culture, right, the Western culture, in fact, there is a lot of difference between the way you look at the world, right? The Indian worldview is completely different from, non-Indian worldviews. So her mother being German, though she tried to, fit in and, tried to practice many Indian traditions, but she never felt at home as such, right? In fact, you can see that Anita Desai's childhood, days have, been dealt with as major themes in her novels also. And coming to her novels, her style actually, she writes in a very poetic, and descriptive way. Her prose style is very poetic, and there is a lot of symbolism. There's a lot of imagery, and I remember still when I tried to read, perhaps when I was in my undergraduation, Anita Desai. It was very complex. It was very difficult to follow her because some of her books are very heavy in terms of comprehension. But of course, as I grew older, because now it's easier to appreciate with so much experience of life also behind the reader. So basically, in many of her novels, she explores the lives of many middle class women and the kind of the tensions that exist in these families. So since many of her novels deal with many of the women's lives, people think that that was the main thing. So always Anita Desai is seen as dealing with the lives of women, but it's not true that she deals only with that. There are larger issues, okay, which she does talk about in her work. So that also has to. Can you please mute yourself? Is that Uma? Uma, can you mute, please? Okay. So, she has several novels to her credit. Her major, novels are. Her first novel is known as Cry the Peacock. Okay. And it does talk about the incompatibility of marriage and explores the heroine's psyche. I see Uma. Can you please mute yourself? Look for the icon and just click on it, please. Or can you be muted, please, the coordinator?
Ma'am, actually you are having the access to mute them, ma'am.
No, I don't have. Sometimes they give it at the end, right? They do it only when they are leaving it.
Ma'am, actually, the host is supposed to mute everyone.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the host is supposed to make you professor to be the co-host when session is in progress.
What they have been doing when they leave the class at the end, just before. They do it around 5 o'clock or just before the class.
Because this will create a lot of trouble while you are explaining.
Yeah, because it interferes. Yeah. So
yes, ma'am. Yeah.
deliberately also. Some of them may not be familiar, so that's also possible.
At least students should have certain etiquettes, ma'am. How to attend the class when online session is in progress. At least they should feel responsible because all these things professors are taking to explain us.
I have a feeling that, she's kind of trying. I didn't keep the... Anyway, let us try to... So, 1 second.
Uma garu, mute your device.
Uma, please mute.
Uma garu, mute your device. Open this slide. Uma garu, mute your device. All are waiting for ma'am. Ma'am is explaining.
Okay, I've tried calling, so I hope they'll take care. Meanwhile, we'll continue. So I was telling you about Anita Desai, and I was telling you how she's her novels do deal with many of women, and then of course she does deal with her first novel, Cry the Peacock, deals with an incompatible marriage. Okay. And this novel established her as a very significant writer. And she has various themes. I'll just give you 3 or 4 and then we'll come to the short story. So there's her novel Voices in the City. Now in Voices in the City, she's examining, the changing transition from the rural India to urban India. For example, she talks about a family where, they are in the rural part of West Bengal, and they move to Calcutta, some of the characters. So basically, she is examining the experiences in the city of Calcutta, where many of her characters find the city a very oppressive city, okay, as an oppressive city. And so she does deal with different themes. Then in Bye Bye Blackbird, she does talk about the themes of rejection and acceptance and nostalgia and alienation, because here she's talking about the immigrants also. So when people move to different places, where is that sense of nostalgia and alienation? I'll talk about this more when I'm talking about Lahiri. So Fire on the Mountain is again a award-winning novel, and it's praised for its symbolism and things like that. And her latest books, Fasting and Feasting. She talks about, she examines the East-West for example, fasting and feasting. In this novel, fasting represents the Indian worldview and feasting represents the Western view. Okay, so she uses she has examined several themes in her novels, and so her work has been really appreciated, and she has won several awards. And 2014, she was awarded the Padma Bhushan. So before that, several awards. She's a Sahitya Academy Fellow. She was, I told you, she was shortlisted for Booker Prize, and she is the part of Royal Society of Literature. She won the several international prizes also, and currently she is a professor of humanities in MIT. Okay, and she also taught at Cambridge and Oxford. So she is an accomplished author, and we see that in several things. Her reception, her popularity, and of course, the different awards that she has won. And in some of her novels, she has also explored. Because I told you, Anita Desai is somebody who knows, she has, her mother being German, her father being Indian, she has this exposure to both the cultures, and she is able to kind of look at the culture from inside, as an insider, also as an outsider. So that's one thing that we have to remember. Anita Desai has also written, short stories, right? So she has written several short stories which were published at different points of time as such. Now, our story, the story prescribed for us, Accompanist, was published in a collection called. I'll just look up. So it is from Games in Twilight, right? So I think that is the one. And just let me, Games at Twilight. I'm just trying to, I have a different collection. I have a different book where many of our stories are there. But this one is taken from a collection called Games at Twilight. So there are several stories, and the one prescribed for us is The Accompanist. Games at Twilight was published in the year 1978. It was published in the 1978, and so we will look at the story. Now, as I said, this is a short story, and I'm sure you will be able to read it. And the story, like what Anita Desai is known for, does explore the inner. Okay, so she is into exploring the thought process also. So people have said, she has this influence of, or she's like Virginia Woolf, where Virginia Woolf also, if you remember, her stream of consciousness, she deals with the psychology of the character, and she explores the inner happenings in the mind as such. So in that sense, Anita Desai also does that. So now this short story, The Accompanist, appears in the collection called Games at Twilight, I told you, published in 1978. It explores the emotional state. It explores the emotional state of a Tanpura artist. Okay, Tanpura, the tambura, right? So Tanpura artist, and so if you look at the instrument Tanpura, if you look at any concert, and if you have either the musicians, whether they are singers or they are playing instruments, so they are vocalists or instrumentalists, the instrument of tanpura or tambura is extremely important, but still very invisible. I mean, usually the tanpura artist sits, behind them or beside them, and they're somewhere almost invisible, but they just have to keep on repeating. I mean, they just go on pulling at the strings, strumming the strings. There are only those three, and then they keep on doing it. So in a way, it is like the tanpura artist who is important, because based on they are very important for the musicians, but at the same time, they are not in the forefront, right? It is the other, the artist who sings or the artist who plays the other instrument gets all the attention, right? So these people are behind. They're just sitting there, almost invisible. So actually, Desai explores the story, the relationship between a tanpura artist and his guru, right? The person with whom he plays. So look at the title also. So the title is also the Accompanist. Okay, it's called the Accompanist, and so accompanist here means somebody who accompanies, right? So there is somebody who is the prime person, there is somebody who is the important person, and then you have the accompanist who accompanies him. So the title also is significant, where he talks about Desai is dealing with the role of an accompanist, and also how the tanpura artist, his loyalty, right, to his master, right, with whom he plays. So it deals with that. I'll just tell you the gist. But I was trying to draw your attention to the title right in the beginning, where you have somebody, let us say if we are going walking, when we say the accompanist, the person who is doing the walking is the main person, right? And then you have the accompanist, or if it is a dancer on the stage. So there is somebody who is dancing and all others are accompanists. So see how Anita Desai focuses on the not so important, where the role of this person is not considered so important, though it is so important, isn't it? So they keep the musician, particularly a tanpura artist, he or she keeps the main artist grounded, but still they are not given the same kind of importance, or maybe it's not recognized. So I'm trying to draw your attention to the point that how Anita Desai in a very subtle way looks at the in any way marginalized character or persons. So in a concert, if you imagine a music concert, you have for example, a tabla player or a sitarist or a veena player, or so these are all the artists, or a vocalist, for example. So they will be, even if you see how they are seated, right? So that is the person who's seated at the center, and then there are so many. But at least, supposing, let us say, we have a singer, we have a tablist, we have other players. Then we have always the tanpura artist somewhere who's sitting there, right, as part of the group. Or sometimes there are no other accompaniments for a vocalist or for any other musician. Tanpura at least is a must, right? So even a vocalist has a tanpura artist, but the point is they are visible yet invisible. They are important yet not given the important role also. So I was fascinated where she takes this relationship between a musician and his accompanist, and then she explores the emotional state of a tanpura artist as such. So coming to the story, in this story, we have the musician whose name is Ustad Rahim Khan, okay, and he is seen as somebody who is a great musician, and he has this accompanist. He's been called the accompanist, okay, usually called Bhaiya, I believe, in the circle. So the accompanist and the Ustad Rahim Khan. So the short story Accompanist explores the lives of the accompanist and the Ustad, and who are happy to pursue, this path of music. And so in this story, we have these two characters, around whom the whole story revolves, right? So coming to the accompanist, he is very, very sincerely, fully committed, and he is a devoted follower of his master, the Ustad. So he is a Tanpura player to Ustad Rahim Khan, and we come to know in the story that he is a very noted, famous classical musician. And when the story opens, the accompanist is about 30 or so. And so we come to know through the story that this accompanist had come to the master when he was just a boy of 15 years. He was only 15. So he has been with his Ustad for 15 years. And the story always, moves back and forth. That is the structure Anita Desai uses. It's narrated in flashes, okay, flashback kind of technique she uses. And so we come to know that this boy has been with the Ustad for 15 years, and right from because he's been there as a boy, he has a lot of knowledge. He gains a lot of knowledge of music, okay. But before that itself, we come to know that the boy's father, he was a musical instrument maker, okay. He used to make musical instruments, and in fact his father wants him, to become like him, because an musical instrument maker also should have a lot of knowledge, isn't it? But somehow this boy gets attached to this master, and this accompanist, he remains a lifelong Tanpura accompanist to his master, Ustad Rahim Khan. And we come to know that, he's extremely fond of his master, and he has a profound and unimaginable love for his master. So he finds the master as somebody who is perfect, somebody who is, very good at his art. And so this boy proves to be a very faithful and obedient, disciple or pupil, actually, in that sense. So in a way, you can say that the accompanist also explores the Guru Sishya Parampara, because in the Indian musical context, we know there are several movies. You may have read several other works. You may have watched movies, right? So there are a lot of texts which deal with the Guru Sishya Parampara. So in this story also, she also explores the relationship between the teacher and the taught kind of relationship. Though here the boy is not a disciple as such, but still in a way he is learning, and he learns a lot. So while being the accompanist, he gains a lot of knowledge of music. Of course, he has been trained by his own father, but he gains a lot of knowledge. So in the story, the accompanist, recalls his childhood memories, and so he tries to recall. He recalls one incident where he has his childhood friends, Ajit and Bhula. And these two of his friends had tried to, when he goes home, okay, they kind of ridicule him, right? They try to provoke him. They try to tell him, hey, look, they say, bhai, go back to the sitar. You even know how to play the sarod and the veena, right? You could be great ustad yourself with some practice. So this is what they tell him, right? What are you doing here? You know better. I mean, you know how to play the sitar, the sarod, the veena. So in fact, you could be a ustad if you practice. And they tell him that we are telling you this for your own good. So when you become famous and go to America, you will thank us for this advice. Why do you spend your life sitting at the back of the stage and playing that idiotic tanpura while someone else takes all the fame and all the money from you? I just read that from the story. So where they say, learn all that. So we understand what they're trying to do here, isn't it? You know, you have the talent and you have the talent, you know so many instruments. So why do you want to play the second fiddle to your ustad? You can be the center, right? And then they try to provoke him, saying you can become famous, you'll be a celebrity, then you can go abroad, and when you become a celebrity, you will remember us, you know, because we gave you this advice. So the way they say, you know, why do you want to spend your life sitting at the back of the stage and playing that idiotic tanpura, and someone else takes all the fame and all the money from you? So when he hears this, the accompanist, you know, he cries, and so he, on hearing this, basically he recalls his other things. Immediately everything feels to be something very unpleasant, you know. He recollects several past incidents of his life when, you know, he used to just move about without an aim, you know, without any hope. So he just feels that he had been leading a very meaningless life, okay. And then he recalls his childhood, and so we learn a little bit about his childhood in the story. So she creates that picture where, you know, the accompanist has been brought up in very humble environment, because we know that the people who make musical instruments, you know, they are not so rich, right? I mean, this has nothing to do with the story, but I always feel that with relation to other things also. For example, for women, many of us wear silk saris, but the silk saris which are woven by the weavers, right? Their families, they don't have enough to make the both ends meet. So I was reminded of that. So people who actually create such beautiful creations, but they themselves remain poor. I mean, that's how the economic system works, right? I digressed, but it just made me think of that. Not only in this, in many aspects, you know.
Even farmer also, madam.
Yes, you take. That's why it's representative. Okay, you take of people who are producers, who are actual producers, right? Who are actual producers, remain poor, and they don't benefit from the profits that people get. So coming back, sorry, I digress, but as I always say, text becomes a context. Text becomes a pretext to talk about the context. So what I felt here is, you know, Anita Desai is also exploring that. So the family remains poor, and the accompanist named Father Mishra, okay, he is a maker of musical instruments, and so naturally, when he has to make musical instruments, he should know a wide range of instruments, isn't it? Music is worshipped in his family, so he remembers how about his family, his childhood, and how music, plays a central role in his family. And he remembers in his house also that they have one hall, one room where there are all these musical instruments made by his father and his grandfather, right? So he remembers all that. But the accompanist somehow feels that he did not wish to carry his family tradition. His father wants him to carry the family tradition. So, whereas the accompanist, he is interested in doing something else, he becomes a tanpura player. His father tells him. So, I'm sure we can look at this story from another angle. Sometimes what happens, a doctor's son or daughter has to become a doctor or farmer. We had this. Originally we did have these family traditions as such, right? But supposing somebody doesn't want to carry on that tradition, so what happens, right? So tradition and modernity, tradition and change, the father-son relationship. I'm looking at the story from different perspectives, right? So here, the accompanist, the father keeps saying, you should carry and keep on our family tradition and hold it high. But the accompanist, he is not interested in so much in this kind of tradition. Initially, he likes the accompanist does like music. Okay, he starts learning the different ragas and raginis from his father right from the age of 4. Right, so he remembers how his father used to be very strict while teaching and also while testing his knowledge in music. Okay, and so he remembers how his father used to be very strict with him. Sometimes he would pull his ears, right, to make him concentrate. So what happens is he remembers the harsh scoldings of his father, or his ears being grabbed. All that he remembers. So he feels that he wants to escape from such harsh and intense, musical teaching that he gets from his fathers. So when he's a boy, he doesn't like that. He wants to escape. So Desai gives a description of how, as a boy, he bunks his musical classes and he wants to go and play, the gilli danda or the kho or marbles. So he likes to go out with all the mischievous boys of his mohalla, of his neighborhood, and he wants to play with them. But he grows up into a teenage boy, and so he remembers. So that's why, first he recalls his childhood, and then, slowly he recalls how he was in his teens. So in his teens, he remembers the lifestyle of the city, how he used to go in the bazaars. And he recalls sometimes he would watch 6 films, okay, in a week. So every day one film, and so for him, Nargis and Meena Kumari, these were those popular actors of those days, Nargis and Meena Kumari, if some of you remember and some of you are familiar. So Nargis and Meena Kumari, very, very famous actors of that era. So for him, he would go watch their movies, and they were like queens of heaven for him. They were like apsaras, okay? And so he wanted to watch these films, but when he wanted to watch, he never had the money. So sometimes he, doesn't hesitate to steal money from his father's pocket, okay, or from his mother's savings. So he doesn't tell them, and he doesn't mind also, because, he's so fond of all this. Then not only films, he's also very fond of sweets. So, he loved eating halwa or jalebi. So all those finer things are described by Desai. So, and he thinks that his mother is a wonderful cook. Okay. And so he used to steal his brother's share, sister's share of sweets. Okay. And then everybody would scold him and, beat him up sometimes. Right. So basically everybody thought, this person is a, irresponsible and unsociable, and not. So the whole in the whole story, Anita Desai describes all this, and then This is the flashback. Then we come to know that the accompanist, he meets the ustad for the first time when he is a boy of 15, right? Because his father tells him that, I have made a tanpura, which he had ordered. So please go and deliver the tanpura to the ustad. So it is when that this accompanist, who is about 15 years old, first time he goes and gives, he goes to the ustad to hand over the tanpura. And so he goes there, and the ustad sees this boy. He's standing there with the tanpura in his both hands, and ustad asks him whether he can play tanpura for the concert, okay, instead of his his earlier accompanist, okay. And from that moment, we see a lot of change in the boy. So he realizes how he has changed himself completely. He had completely, and somewhere in the story, he says, for 15 years now, this has been our way of life, right? So he agrees to become an accompanist to the ustad, and from that moment, the accompanist, completely is transformed, and he also loves music, but he also loves Ustad Rahim Khan very much, and suddenly everything changes in his life, okay? And he gives up all his childhood pranks and pleasures. So whatever naughty things he used to do, all that stops. And now all that he can think of is, paying attention to Ustad. And so he always accompanies him wherever he is performing. And then he also gives up his past kind of life. His center of his life is Ustad Rahim Khan, right? And so music takes its place. The friends disappear, the cinema disappeared, all his naughtiness disappears, and music becomes the center of his life, and that becomes the goal of his life, right? So he recalls how playing, or being the accompanist for Ustad Rahim Khan brought several changes in his life. And that is when he takes a new birth as Bhaiya, right? So, because in that, they're called Bhaiyas. So he becomes the Tanpura player, and he devotes his whole life to Ustad, and he becomes a true friend and accompanist to his master as such. So on the one hand, you will find this, and then of course he's not interested in anything else. His life is completely dedicated to Ustad, okay? And meanwhile, his parents force him to marry. He's not interested in marrying. He does marry, but what he does is he leaves his wife also behind with his parents. Once in 6 months or once in 6 year, he visits. So he leaves everything, and he just concentrates. He only on the Ustad as such, and so he recalls that. And remember, I told you how he has become such a dedicated accompanist. Okay, so he says that when in the story somewhere he says, when I first met my Ustad, I was a boy of 15, a stupid backward boy, as my father had told me I was. Okay, but then he realizes that how. In fact, he says, before that, I had no life. I was nothing, a dirty, hungry street urchin. Okay. So I had played music only because my father made me, right? So he says, I had stolen money, I had done all that, but it was Ustad Rahim Khan who saw me. Okay. And he called me to come to him and showed me what to do with my life. So he says, I owe everything to him, my very life to him. Right? So he says, he feels that, I'm just reading from the story itself. It was my destiny to play the tanpura for a great ustad, to sit behind me, to sit behind him, where he cannot even see me, and play the notes he needs so that he may not stray from the bounds of his composition when gripped by inspiration. So basically, you can look at the story from so many angles, some readers have pointed out how, in a way, Ustad exploits him because, he's so good, but, he doesn't let him get the fame or anything. And so that's been also seen. But you look at how he feels, and also he feels being a tanpura player is not unimportant. He says that even the tanpura, many people think of tanpura as very insignificant, but actually it is I who play the tanpura that gives the ustad the support that he needs. Okay, so he says, I give him the materials upon which he works, right? He constructs the great music for which the whole world loves him, right? So then he is not unaware that others cannot do it, right? So he says, yes, anyone could play the tanpura for him, do what I do. But for him, this is towards the end of the story, he says, but he did not take anyone else. He chose me. He gave me my destiny, my life. Could I have refused him? And then he says, does a mortal refuse God? So you can see how much, this accompanist worships Ustad. He considers him God because he gives him a very different life as such, right? So all this he recalls when his friends actually ridicule him and tell him that, you're such a fool, and, you could be what Ustad is actually. One second. Sorry. So he says that anyone could have played the tanpura for him, but it's me who the ustad chose, right? So the accompanist develops such a deep bond with the ustad, and then he's angry with himself, and he smiles and he says, how can anybody be such a fool, right? So even I, Bhaiya, right, had known when the hour of my destiny had struck, right? So even a backward boy from the streets had recognized his God when he met him. I could not have refused. I took up the tanpura and played for my ustad, and I have played for him since. So he says, I could not have wished for a finer destiny. And the last 3 lines of the story, leaving the park, I hailed a tonga and ordered the driver to take me to my ustad. Never in my life had I spoken so loudly as surely as I did then. You should have heard me. I wish my ustad had heard me. So this is how the story ends, where he is giving an answer to his friends, who ridicule him, who mock him, who tell him, you are being exploited. You yourself can be famous, right? Because you know so many things. And why can't you be that? But now he says, he's very angry when his friends tell him that he can be better and all. So, therefore, he's very unhappy with his friends, and then he decides, because, he has his friends, remember Ajit and Bola, I just mentioned in the beginning. So they are the ones, they keep egging him, they keep provoking him, right? One friend says, Bhai, you used to play so well. Your father was so proud. Your father used to say, you would be a great musician, right? What are you doing sitting at the back of the stage and playing the tanpura for Rahim Khan, right? So it is then that the Bhaiya says, no one had spoken to me in this manner, since my father died. So this is the story is narrated in the first person. It is the bhaiya who is narrating the story, the accompanist who is narrating the story. And then somebody else also says, what sort of instrument is the tanpura? It's not even an accompaniment. It's nothing. Anyone could play it. Just 3 notes over and over again. Even I could play. So they're making fun of him. They're telling him, what are you doing? You're just wasting your life. And they insult, they speak in a very insulting manner as such, right? And so the other friend also says, go to sitar, go to sarod, go to veena. You can be a great ustad, right? So you can be very famous. And so he too says, why do you want to spend your life sitting at the back of the stage? So it's in the story, he says, the accompanist, it looks like they had decided to attack me, right? And they were trying to choke me. And that is where he feels very, very bad about it. But so actually their talk also makes him start thinking, were they right? Were they right? Could I have played the sitar or the sarod, okay, and become an ustad? So he says this idea had never occurred to me, okay, but he recalls, he's very honest, he recalls, yes, my father had taught me to play, but he had never praised me, or he never told me that I could become a front rank musician, okay. So he says that I had learned to play all these things just to be a carpenter, okay, because you have to make the instruments, isn't it? So he says that that was the thing. So he starts questioning himself, after his friends say this, had I wasted my life, right? All these things come. But when he starts recalling, I told you the flashback he has into his life, as a young boy, what all he did and how he had. And then he says that my life was just going waste. And it was at this time that the ustad had shown me the way. Instead of being a maker of the instruments, he comes on to this, play the tanpura, and he's behind as such, right? So he says that, he thinks about it, for a moment he too feels, okay, was I wrong in doing this? But then he knows his strength. He says, it's my destiny to play the tanpura for a great ustad, and he kind of takes it up, right? So as I said in this story, she of course the examines or explores the Guru Shishya Parampara, where in the Indian context, the Guru Shishya Parampara, the Gurus also were always of course cared for the disciple, and the disciples kind of dedicated their whole lives. Things have changed over a period of time, that's different, but that's also one thing. And then of course for me the story also is also about what is big, what is small, what is important, what is unimportant. Just because it's a tanpura, does it? So everything has its place in this world, right? So here that's where at the end you hear the boy saying, isn't it? The man saying that even if it's the tanpura, even if anybody can play it, but ustad chose me. So there is something there, right? So that's where, he talks about how Ustad Rahim Khan had changed his life, and he had become completely transformed. So that also one should remember. So you have all these things here in the story one has to remember. And of course, title I already talked about it. So the accompanist, right? The accompanist is someone who accompanies, right? So it's not so important. But look how Anita Desai shifts the focus from the, chief player to the accompanist and goes into this character. That's why I said Anita Desai is interested in exploring the marginalized. The marginalized can be in any way. It could be socially marginalized, it could be gender-wise marginalized. Here, in this sense, professionally marginalized, you can think of, right? So, the narrative point of view, I told you, it is narrated through the accompanist's point of view, okay? And so, you can say that the accompanist, in Accompanist, Anita Desai examines the crisis or the conflict, okay, in his life, when particularly, and that too, you can also see it as a conflict between him and his friends, right? So his friends try to tell him, you're not doing the right thing, you should be doing this. But he has a desire of his own. He wants to do what he wishes. So again, you can look at it as see, how do I put it? That is, the boy asserts his individual will, right? So you can also think of how, just because parents want a child to do something, or a family tradition has to be continued by the child. So that also, you can see, is challenged in a way, isn't it? Because this boy is completely different, right? He doesn't listen to the father. He doesn't want to continue that. He wants to follow the ustad, and he develops a strong bond between with his ustad, actually, right? So there are several questions, if you really want. I'm sure when you read it, I'm sure you will also look at the story from different perspectives as such. But as I said, the story, you have Anita Desai exploring the inner. So you see the boy's dilemma, you see the accompanist's dilemma when his friends kind of ridicule him, right? So he examines, but he does arrive at his own kind of resolution, or he understands himself. He tries to understand himself. Is this what is happening? Do I want this really, or do I want something else? But he knows what he wants, and he goes on to act upon that, and that's how the story ends as such, right? Okay, what is the time? It's 10:20. So what I'll do is I'll shift to the other.
One second, ma'am.
Yeah.
What is the name of that boy, accompanist?
He's throughout the story he's called Bhaiya.
Bhaiya. Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, just a minute. I'll get the other story. Okay, so we will come to the next story in this. This is Jhumpa Lahiri, the interpreter of maladies, right? So now I'll again talk about Jhumpa Lahiri, her context, and then let's very briefly look at the story. So, coming to the story and interpreter of maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri. Now, let me first tell you that Jhumpa Lahiri is part of the diasporic writers. Okay. Now, if you remember when I was talking about the rise of the Indian novel in English, right? We talked about 30s. Just now I was repeating about 1960s, right? And then 1981, you have Salman Rushdie, a landmark novel which put Indian novel on the global map. And that set a different kind of, guidelines for people to write. And Indian novel, people started exploring it, and people started writing it in very different ways also. And since then onwards, 1990s onwards, we have had several writers and who have had global recognition and who have received national as well as international awards as such. So this was the 1990s we are talking about. But one has to remember that 1990s is also the time of when we have liberalization, the LPG, what we call, right? The globalization, of the economy also starts. And earlier also, many people from India, emigrated, went to other countries, right? We have had that. But it was during the 2000, the diasporic writing emerges. It becomes very popular. There are several diasporic writers who had shifted to America, who had shifted to, different places, and primarily the United States of America. And it was these people who started writing. It's not as if they started writing then. There were earlier also. For example, you have many like Bharti Mukherjee, Anita Desai herself, she has always stayed in away from India also. She has divided her time between, India and the US. And of course, now she stays sometime in Mexico, sometimes in US, right? So we do have this generation of writers who did write about their immigrant experiences, right? When they went to other countries, new cultures, new ideas, new communities. So they have dealt with those issues as such. So these are called the diasporic writers. I'm giving you very briefly because we don't have time for details. So the diasporic, many of you are aware, the diaspora today is again very, very vibrant, right? You have so many people moving to different places, coming back and all. So when we are talking about diasporic writers, there were writers like Bharti Mukherjee, these were first generation. For example, they had been born and brought up in India, and then they shifted to, these places wherever their adopted homelands. And so these were all first generation writers. But then you talk about the second and you talk about the third generation writers, where their parents had already been settled in settled abroad, and these children are born in these countries, right? So their adaptation is very different from the parents. For example, first generation of diaspora, you find writers talking a lot about a sense of loss of homeland. So their stories are marked by themes of alienation. They are in a new land and they are, they feel lost in this new land, new culture, new habits, and new customs, right? And also there is a strong sense of nostalgia. So somewhere, there is a longing for their home country. So these are some of the common themes that you have in the first generation of diasporic writers. But when you come to diasporic, writers like Jhumpa Lahiri, who is from the second generation, right? So their themes could be different, right? They deal with both. So there are these writers now, second generation, third generation, where they are actually settled. They are born and brought up in those countries, but still, they have the connection with India and home, right? So slightly the themes in these writers varies a bit because they are exploring several other things. Okay, of course, in the first generation, they're looking for roots. They're looking for nostalgia for the homeland and all. You don't find that much in these writers. So I just wanted you to keep that in mind, just as a background. So coming to Jhumpa Lahiri and interpreter of melodies. So if we are talking about Jhumpa Lahiri, many of you may have read her books also because she is a contemporary writer, and she has won the Pulitzer Prize, so which made her a celebrity. Okay, so coming to Jhumpa Lahiri, she was born in 1967 in London, in England. Okay, and so she as I said, she belongs to the second generation where, the parents are already settled there. So she was born in London and raised in Rhode Island, and her parents, Bengali parents, okay. Her parent, one of them was a teacher and a librarian, okay. And but the parents regularly used to come to Calcutta, India, to visit the family. So Lahiri also, though born there as a child, and later she kept coming with her parents to India as such. But Lahiri, born and brought up there, educated, okay, in England and then later in USA, and she has MA degrees in English literature and creative writing, okay, and comparative literature. She also has a PhD, right? So that is briefly about Jhumpa Lahiri. And Jhumpa Lahiri is well known for her representation of immigrant and Indian American life. Okay, so though she focuses on the immigrant lives and the Indian American life particularly, okay, but her stories have been praised for some of the common themes of longing, of loneliness, and also her stories are known for depicting the problems in communication, so she examines also how communication or breakdown of communication also can cause a lot of problems. So then coming to this short story, it's taken from a collection of short stories whose name is Interpreter of Maladies, right? So what we have to remember is Interpreter of Maladies is the name of a story. It's also the name of the collection of stories. So actually the story is the title story. So this was her first book. Jhumpa Lahiri's first book of short stories is Interpreter of Maladies, and this was published in 1999. So this is her debut collection of short stories, and it has been translated into several languages around the world. I don't know how many now, but it is said that 25 to 30 languages around the world it has been published, and it became a bestseller both in America and other places. So, and she won the Pulitzer Prize also for this story. When she first wrote this in the New Yorker, I believe. Her first stories appeared there, and she won several awards, and she has won the Pulitzer Prize, she has won the O. Henry Award, and several awards you can just look up, right? So then later Jhumpa Lahiri wrote her novels. So her first novel is The Namesake. So The Namesake again deals with the common diasporic themes I talked about, right? Identity, right? The namesake. So the identity, question of identity, who are you, right? Hybrid identity, all these issues are found in the namesake as such. So Jhumpa Lahiri, of course, has written other novels. One is The Namesake, I told you. Then I think the latest was The Lowland. One is, I remember, The Unaccustomed Earth, and then The Lowland, I think, is the latest, if I'm right. Or you can just look up The Unaccustomed Earth and the Lowland, okay. But coming to Interpreter of Maladies. So this is, I told you, her debut collection, and this has been praised, in America and other places as a very insightful, and it has been called deeply American, okay. So she is identified as an American writer, and so somebody wrote saying that Lahiri's stories, are about anybody who feels like a foreigner at home or abroad. Okay, so that is one comment that has been made on her work. And of course, in this, you can see that Lahiri herself has tried to explore her own feelings of cultural displacement. Okay, so she has explored cultural displacement and her childhood. So she has said somewhere that when I was growing up, I felt neither Indian nor American. So it reveals the angst of these writers who are settled. I mean, of course, she didn't migrate; she was born there, but still the culture is very different, right? So she says, when I was growing up, I neither felt like Indian because you don't have completely the Indian thing. You're born and brought up and exposed to the American culture. But at the same time, she says, I didn't fit into the American culture too because, you come from a different background and inevitably all those values and culture also come up. So therefore, she says, I felt neither Indian nor American. And like many immigrant, she says, I felt intense pressure to be two things. Okay, so both. And she says, there was this strong pressure I felt always to hold on to the old world, but also be there in the new world. So approved of on either side of the hyphen. Now, what does this hyphen mean? There's an Indian poet who has talked about hyphenated identities, right? For example, we are in India, we are known as Indians. US, they are Americans, but Indians in America are known as Indian Americans. So there is a hyphen there, right? So the Indian American, African American, Chinese American, Asian Americans. So basically, immigrants have this hyphenated identity. So Jhumpa Lahiri has said, I have tried to be both, loyal to the old, but also I want to be loyal to the new. I want to be approved by on either side of the hyphen, right? So I want to be Indian as well as American, right? So in that sense, she says that right from childhood, I had this sense of disorientation, and somehow she feels that all these. And this is what she has tried to explore in her stories. And she says that she has written these stories in order to she says she's writing because she occupies these two worlds, and she says, I want to force the two worlds to mingle on the page. Okay, so her writing, she says, is an expression of her desire to force the two worlds I occupied to mingle on the page as such, right? So those are some of her concerns. And Jhumpa Lahiri is considered, one of the best young fiction writers, and yeah, so I think I was telling you about, I have already talked about the namesake, okay, her other works. Okay, now let us come to the story, Interpreter of Maladies. Now, coming to the story, the title, Interpreter of Maladies. You know what malady is? Malady is a kind of a disease or sickness or illness, right? So, Interpreter of Maladies. Why is it named? We will see a little later. I'll just very briefly tell you the story. And the story, Interpreter of Maladies, for this story, she got the O. Henry Award. Those of you are familiar, O. Henry was considered a very, very talented short story writer. Okay, so she got the O. Henry Award for this short story, and this story has been praised a lot. Okay, it really has been praised, and the whole collection also for dealing with several issues. Okay. And there are several different kinds of characters in the collection of stories, right? Out of the 9 stories, 7 stories are out. They cross the national boundaries. They're set in both India and the United States, right? So coming to this story, because I don't find much time, so I think I should hurry up. Let me tell you the story of interpreter of maladies. Now, this story is the story of a family called the Das family. And this family is visiting India. They are actually Indian Americans. Okay, this family is Indian American, and they are second, third generation. So they are born and brought up in America, though they are Indians. And so they are on a visit to India. They're on a visit to India because every year this family visits Calcutta. Just like, as I said, Jhumpa Lahiri's parents also used to bring her here. So here also they are on a visit to India, and this is where they meet someone named Mr. Kapasi, who is their tour guide. They go on a tour, and he is their driver and tour guide. So he is driving, and then he is the one who's going to take around. So actually the story is of this family and their interaction here, right? Okay. Now, I don't know, I can't go into all the details as such. So the title of the story, it refers to the job of the character, Mr. Kapasi. So actually, Mr. Kapasi now here, he's a driver, he's a tourist guide. He guides them around. But actually, he has another job. What is that job? He has a job of an interpreter. There is a medical clinic. There is a clinic in Calcutta where he works. And here there are patients who come from different places, and so they don't know the language. So what Mr. Kapasi does is he's a translator, he's a interpreter. So basically he is like a bridge between the patient and the doctor. So the patients tell him, and then he in turn tells the doctor. So that is one thing. But it's not only that. An interpreter, can also mean not only from one language to the other, but interpretation can also be seen as different interpretations. Okay, so if you can just think about the word interpretation. So interpretation can be interprets, the patients to the doctor. That's also there. And if you also see, I was telling you, Jhumpa Lahiri is also interested in the lack of communication, I told you, the barriers in communication. So in a way, Kapasi acts as a communicator, right? Because, there is the language barrier between the doctor and the patient, or it could be also other things. So in that sense, interpreter can refer to somebody who translates from one language to the other, but it also means who makes different meanings from a single text, right? Just like we are doing the story, right? When we were discussing all the text, we were talking about how text can be interpreted in different ways, right? There will be different approaches. So in that sense, his work can be seen as a point of connection, right? It can be seen as a bridge between people across languages and worlds as such, right? And as for maladies, I told you, malady basically means something like sickness or illness or disease, right? But malady can be symbolic also. It need not be only physical malady, but it can be something, some other malady, psychological. That becomes important in the context of the story. So, in a way, the story Mr. Kapasi is also one of the central characters. You have Mr. and Mrs. Das, and then you have Mr. Kapasi, who is also one of the important characters. So we saw one job of Kapasi as the interpreter of melody. The other job is he is a tourist guide. Okay, so he's showing people around India. So even there, if you see, he's trying to kind of interpret things, right? He takes people to different places. So that is about Mr. Kapasi. Now, the other family that we have to talk about is the Das's family. They have Mr. and Mrs. Das. They're quite young. Kapasi is older. This is a young couple, and they have 3 children. So you have Tina, Bobby, and Ronnie. Okay, and so these people are Indian by origin, but they live in New Jersey. So in the story, Lahiri describes them as the family looked Indian, but dressed as foreigners did. The children in stiff, brightly colored clothing and caps. Okay, so actually this is a family on a holiday in India, and I won't be able to go into details of the story. It's available. You can read the story, but basically, the story gives us, how while Kapasi is driving the Das family around, different tourist places, right? He observes, he finds this family very strange. Remember, he is an Indian. They are Indian American, born and brought up in America. So their very attitude towards family or children or as parents, it's very different from what Kapasi knows, right? So basically, in the story, we notice that Kapasi notices that the husband and wife are very indifferent. And for example, Lahiri describes when one of the children wants to go to the bathroom, both of them keep saying, you take her. And finally, the wife takes the child. But it's very different from Kapasi, because here, how when a child wants to go somewhere, you know how the mother or the father will not even let go of their hand, and they take them, they escort them. But here he notices that, the wife doesn't hold the hand of the child. She's walking at a long distance. Finally, she comes and then she buys popcorn and they're eating. So, without going into further details, I'll tell you the central thing. So, what Kapasi observes is that the American family, the Indian American family, is very different as such. And Das asks, Mrs. Das asks, what is his job? So he says, I'm an interpreter of melodies also. And she understands this in a symbolic way, right? Of course, the literal way is there. But, and at one point of time, the husband and the children, 3 children, go to see something. And Mrs. Das says, I'm not interested in going. She stays back in the taxi. Meanwhile, we come to know that Mr. Kapasi is, Mrs. Das being born and brought up in America, she is very open and she talks to Kapasi very freely and all. And Kapasi, he thinks she is interested in him. Somewhere, he starts focusing on her. He also has his own dissatisfactions, and he gets he shows interest in her. So he keeps observing her in the mirror and all that. But when these people go to, the father and the children go to see something, Mrs. Das stays back. At that time, she reveals a secret to Mr. Kapasi. And she says, for 8 years, I have not been able to say this to anybody, and certainly not to my husband, Raj, right? He doesn't know. But I want to tell you something. And she thinks that, Kapasi is kind of an interpreter because he works with the doctor. So he can be an interpreter and he can help her also. So she confides in him that actually the one of the children is not by her husband. So she says that this child was born with another man, and the husband doesn't know about this. And when Kapasi comes to know about this, he starts, he basically, she's feeling very, she hasn't told this to anybody, and this has been bothering her, this secret. So this has led to a lot of, maybe it's weighing heavily on her mind as such, right? So what she thinks is, I just have to say this because, she's been carrying this secret and this been a burden on her. So she wants to be relieved of this burden, and she thinks, I'll never ever meet Kapasi, right? So I'll tell him. So in fact, she thinks I'll never meet him, so I'll unburden myself to Kapasi. But for Kapasi, it's a very different thing, right? And suddenly, he thinks of her in a very different way. Till now, he thought of her in a very different way. And suddenly, his view of this woman changes. He thinks she's a woman who is not even 30 and who loves neither her husband nor her children. And she has already, behaving like this. So somehow he is very disappointed. He feels very depressed, right? And somehow he says, look, you should confess to your husband. And then, he asks her whether she feels guilty. And when he asks that whether she feels guilty, that is the end of conversation between them two, because Mrs. Das also is very disappointed because she thinks that he can understand her. He thinks that, she can confess it and try to understand. But actually, she expresses her pain. She expresses her pain, and she's trying to express that. But here he interprets it in a different way, and he asks her, "Are you feeling guilty, right? Because you are unfaithful to your husband?" And so, when she's asked if she was feeling guilty, she immediately, stops talking to him because she goes to her husband who's waiting, and they're all taking pictures there, and that's where the kind of the story ends. There's a lot. I have not gone into details because of the time. I think I should have managed it slightly in a better way. I focus more on Anita Desai. Anyway, so you can now at some point of time, Kapasi's number Mrs. Das had taken. Okay, he had written on a piece of paper. She thinks if necessary, I'll have it. But the story ends where while Mrs. Das is going out, she takes out something from her bag, and the paper on which Kapasi's number or address is there, that falls down, and Kapasi notices that, right? He notices it, and then that's where the novel ends here. So there are several things to this story. One is she brings out the different perspectives between the Indian perspective and the Indian American perspective, right? That's one thing one has to remember. See, because while she's talking about her experience, Mrs. Das narrates the background in which it happens. Both of them marry very young, and then Raj becomes very busy with his job, and she's, after one child, she's completely stuck in the rut of that domestic thing, and she's very frustrated. She feels very helpless, and so in that moment, the husband's friend is there, and that's where that physical meeting happens between. And then this child is born. Of course, she doesn't reveal that to the husband. So basically, that is one thing that one has to remember. Then, of course, another theme you can remember is the interpretation, right? So Kapasi, who is seen as an interpreter of maladies, but he himself, is not able to interpret. And at the end, actually, he is the one who's suffering from the malady where he misinterprets and, he doesn't understand at all. And there is a lack of communication. So lack of communication and lack of interpretation between them is also there. So this story, she analyzes, she explores the difference between this the American Indian American couple, okay, who are very different, who seem very different to Kapasi, because he comes from a very different part of the world. So though they look like Indians, right? That's also one of the things one can remember, that they seem to be Indians. They appearance-wise, features and physical features are Indian, but having been born and brought up there, their approach to life, their perspective is very different. And Kapasi, who's completely been born and brought up in India, he has a very different kind of a view as such. So here it can be seen as whether there can be a bridge between the East and the West. So this theme has been explored earlier also, the East and the West. I told you even in Anita Desai, the connection, the link and the conflict, or whether the East and West can come together. So there are several writers who have explored this relationship. So Jhumpa Lahiri's story also is exploring one such thing. So the interpretation is not just from one language to the other, but how the perspective itself changes. That also one has to remember as such. So I think, I see it's 10:55. So you have a class next at 11 and I think you need a break. So I'll stop for now. What I'll do is I still have one more class with you. That is at 1:30 today, post lunch. So I'll see you then, and if you have any sub-questions regarding this, we will continue. And then I'll go on to the next text, which is Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste. Okay. So I think I'll stop for now. If there are any questions, we'll take in the next session. Okay. Right.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.